Greetings, this is Amy Wentley with Chi Knuckles Knitting, and this is episode 2022-28, the Davis T, separating front and back and neck shaping. So this is a demo on how to separate the front from the back once you get to the armholes on the Davis T sweater. The Davis T is a pattern distributed by Quince & Company by Pam Allen. And at this point, this is going to be a demo. My demo has 60 stitches on it. You will begin separating for the front and back on many more stitches. So for the smallest size, it would be 156 stitches you'll be dealing with. For the other sizes, they'll increase. But when you get to separating for the front and back, what you're basically going to be doing is bisecting the stitches on your needle. So if you have 156, that means you would have 78 stitches on the front and 78 stitches on the back when you start the separation. So for me, I have 60 stitches here, so I'm going to have 30 on the front and 30 on the back. So right after the instructions in the pattern that say separate front and back, it will say next round knit a certain number of stitches, and that certain number of stitches is going to be half the stitches on your needle. And then place the remaining half of the stitches on waste yarn. And then it says to turn the work. So at this point, we're going to be going from working rounds to working rows. So this very first row in separating front and back is the next round. Once we finish this round, we'll start doing rows. So the first instruction says knit half your stitches essentially. So I'm going to go ahead and pause and knit half my stitches, and then I will show you what comes next. Hi, I'm back. So I just finished working half my stitches. For me, that was 30. And then the next part of the instruction says place the remaining half of stitches onto waste yarn. And so what we're going to do there is I'm going to take a piece of waste yarn. It's worsted weight yarn, so it's a little lighter than what I have. You can use a yarn that's just as thick or lighter, but not too light in comparison to weight of what your sweater is. So I'm going to thread this waste yarn onto a darning needle, and I am going to move these stitches, just slipping them as if to purl, onto this darning needle and then onto the waste yarn. And I just pull a little bit of yarn through at a time as I get all these things, trying not to split my yarn, getting all these stitches on here. So this is half of my stitches, and it's just moving the stitches, slipping as if to purl, until I get to my beginning of round marker again, which is coming up shortly. See it right there? Okay. And once we get all these stitches on our waste yarn, we're going to knot our waste yarn so that we don't have to worry about any of those stitches falling off the waste yarn, because we really don't want stitches just dropping and running everywhere. So there we go. So I got to my beginning of round marker. I'm just going to drop that marker off. I have these stitches on waste yarn now. Make sure the waste yarn is much wider than what you're going to hold, So you have a bunch left over. You can take the ends and you can just tie them in a loose knot. There you go. Sometimes I'll do a slip knot, sometimes I'll just do a regular knot. Doesn't matter. Okay, so now these are held. They're going to be there while you work on the front. Okay, so once I got these stitches onto the waste yarn, the next thing in the instruction says turn work. And that means we're going to start working flat. Okay, the first instruction under the front says next row. So that's the clue right there that we're going to start working flat. We're going to start working rows instead of rounds. Okay. So the first instruction under the front says next row on the wrong side. So you know you're on the wrong side because you're looking at the purl bumpy side of your stockinette stitch. It says using a backward loop cast on one stitch. Okay, so the way that you cast on using a backward loop cast on, and I'll get a little closer for you so you can see this a little better. All you do is make a loop out of your yarn like this with the working yarn on the inside and just pass it onto your needle like that and pull it close. I think they call this a half hitch. So there you go. And now purl to the end. So you're going to purl all the stitches here and then you're going to cast on one more stitch. Okay, so I'm going to pause for a moment while I purl up to the end and I'll show you how to cast on that last stitch. I'll be right back. I'm back. I do want to mention that there appears to be an error in the pattern. For the front section, the first instruction says next row, wrong side, using a backward loop cast on one stitch, and then it says turn work. You don't need to turn the work because you're already on the purl side and you're going to purl all these stitches. So no need to turn the work there. And then it says purl to the end, which I have done, and then it says cast on one more stitch. And so to do that, here's the backward loop cast on again. You make a loop with your working yarn so that the working yarn is attached and kind of trapped in the middle there, and that's a backward loop cast on. So now you have half of your stitches plus 2 on the needle. And what the instructions say then is to go ahead and continue working stockinette stitch for a certain measurement for your size. And then this is, you work a certain amount from the underarm. So you start measuring here where you separated, and you'll work that length in stockinette stitch, and you end after a right side row. So I'm going to go ahead, just for the sake of the demo, I'm going to work a few rows of stockinette stitch here, and then I will come back to you, and that will be at the point, we will then be at the point with the last instruction on the front section that says next row place markers. So I'll be right back. Hi, I'm back. So I just finished a right side row of that stockinette portion, starting at where we separated for the front and the back. That's actually going to be our underarm now. And I finished a little over an inch. For you, it's going to be anywhere from 3.5 inches to 6.5 inches, depending on what your size is. So the next instruction tells us from the wrong side, we're going to place markers. So where we're placing markers is right where the bottom of the neckline is going to be. And so the instruction reads, purl a certain number of stitches, then place a marker, purl 10, place a marker, and purl a certain number of stitches. For me, you're going to put markers around 10 stitches. I'm going to put them around 6 because I'm working with a smaller piece here than you are. So I'm going to start out by purling. For me, it's going to be 13. For you, it's probably going to be anywhere between 30 something and 50 something. Sorry, went off camera there for a minute while I was reading the pattern. Man, you didn't really need to see me sit here and just purl things. So again, I'm purling 13 and I'm going to place a marker. So I think I'm getting close maybe. Nope. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. And I'm just going to double check because I don't want to get my counting wrong. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Place a marker. And I'm going to purl 6. You will be purling 10. And this is for the bottom of my neckline. And this is the front of the sweater. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then I purl to the end of the row. So what happens now is you're going to move on to the begin neck shaping section. And I want to point out at this point that you are going to start working the right shoulder and the left shoulder simultaneously with 2 different balls of yarn. So I'm going to show you how to add that yarn on this next row. The other thing you need to be aware of is from now on, you're going to start to notice a semicolon in the instructions. And the semicolon is going to separate what's happening on the right shoulder from the left shoulder. And I am going to talk about that in just a minute. So at the begin neck shaping section on that very first row, it says on the right side, knit to the marker. And I'm going to do that. And at this point, what you're going to need to do is get yourself another ball of yarn. You should have it because you shouldn't have used up all your yarn yet. So go ahead and get another ball of yarn ready. So I'm knitting my 13, and then it says knit to marker, and then it says join a new ball of yarn. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I get to my marker, I'm going to drop my marker off, and then I have a new ball of yarn here. It's a smaller one. I'm going to take the end of the ball of yarn, leave myself a tail, and drape it like this. I'm going to insert my needle as if to knit and drape my yarn over and pinch it and pull it through. And that's how I add the new ball of yarn. Make sure you have a good tail because you'll want to weave that in later, and make sure you don't work with your tail. So this is the first stitch. The next instruction, well, this instruction said join a new ball of yarn and bind off all stitches to the next marker, removing the marker to bind off the last stitch. So now I'm supposed to be binding off. Well, this is my first stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and knit another stitch, and then I am going to lift the first stitch over the second. And this first stitch is loose because it's my tail. So pull your tail tight, you're good. So that was bind off 1. And I'm going to bind off to the marker now. So that's 2, that's 3, excuse me, that's 4, and this is 5. And in order to bind off that 6th stitch, we're going to need to remove this marker and bind off with the next stitch. Now the reason that we're doing that is I have 13 stitches here now on the next shoulder, and I want it to match the 13 stitches on the other shoulder that I worked already. But I also have this extra stitch from this bind off. excuse me, in order to get a total of 13 here, I have to bind off one more stitch. That's why we're doing that. So now we have 13 stitches for each shoulder. So there's this over here with my big ball attached, and there's this over here that I'm using my little ball for. And I'm going to work the rest of these stitches, and I'm going to end up knit them, and I'm going to end up having the same number of stitches on each shoulder. I will finish this and I will be back in a moment. I'm back. So now we have, and this is looking at the back, we have our shoulder stitches here with our new little yarn attached. Then we have a gap where the bottom of the neckline is, and we have the other shoulder with the bigger ball of yarn attached. So it doesn't matter whether your yarn balls are bigger or smaller, whatever, that's just how mine happen to turn out. Okay, so the next instruction is where the semicolon starts to really come in handy to pay attention to. So you might want to highlight your pattern and highlight the semicolons, because what the semicolon designates is this gap. So you'll work some stitches, and then when you hit the semicolon, you're going to bridge this gap, pick up the new ball of yarn and drop the old one, and keep going. So the next instruction says purl to right neck edge. So this is purling to here. And once I get to that right neck edge, there is a semicolon, there is the gap. And so at that point, we're going to want to drop the yarn that we've been using so far and pick up the new yarn. So let me get to the gap. Okay, I am at the gap now, at the semicolon, so I read the next part of that instruction, and it tells me to bind off 3 stitches and purl to the end. So we're going to drop this yarn here, just leave it, and we're going to pick up the other yarn that's attached here, and we're going to start off by binding off 3 stitches. That needs to be in the front. Okay, so binding off 3 stitches. So these are going to be purled. So we're going to purl 2, and we're going to lift the first stitch over the second, and I will move to English knitting so as to not confuse you. Sorry about that. Hold that in my right hand for you, and let me fix that split yarn. Wow. Okay, there we go. So that was 1 bound off. Bring yarn to the front, purl the next stitch. That's going to be 2 bound off. The yarn's in the front, purl the next stitch, 3 bound off. Okay, and then we're going to purl to the end. So I'll give you one more example of that. The next one, the next instruction says knit to the neck edge semicolon. So as soon as I finish this row, we can start that one. Okay, so it says knit to the next edge semicolon. And this is still with the same ball of yarn that's attached here. So I'm going to knit to, I flipped to Continental again. Sorry about that. Goes a little faster for me, so bear with me if you don't mind. So I knit to the neck edge, and once I hit that gap, that tells me it's time to drop my yarn. I'm going to move it over there. and then it's going to be time to pick up the new yarn. The second part of that instruction says bind off 3 stitches and knit to end. Okay, so I'm going to bind off 3 stitches, and this time it's with knitting. So I'm going to knit 1, knit 2, and make sure you're using the right yarn. Always check that that gap is clear and that you use the right yarn. 2, and I think that's 3. Hold on a second. I'll know for sure because I'm supposed to be at this point having 9, it's going to be 10 stitches on each side. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I need to bind off 1 more for 3. So I'm going to have 10 stitches on each shoulder now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I knit to the end here. The last instruction in the in this section, the begin neck shaping section, has me purl to the neck edge and then semicolon and then bind off 2 stitches and purl to the end. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I'm going to come back to you at the beginning of the begin shoulder shaping and continue neck shaping section. Okay, be right back. Okay, I'm back. So this is going to be the last row that I'm going to show you. This row is actually going to include some neck shaping and also some shoulder shaping that involves doing wrap and turn short rows. So I'm going to go ahead and step through the instruction. I'm going to show how to do a wrap and turn short row, but if you need more information about that, I'll have a link in the video description that you can go and view a video on how to do wrap and turn short rows. Okay? So this says begin shoulder shaping and continue neck shaping, and it says next row short row 1, and it's right side. So it starts out by saying knit to neck edge. So I'm going to do that. That's just knitting again until we get to the gap. And I believe I'm down to 7 stitches here. Okay. And then I get to the gap, so that means I drop my 1 ball of yarn and I'm going to get ready to use my other ball of yarn. Okay, on the other shoulder. So it then says, then bind off 2 stitches. So we'll start off by doing that. Bind off 2 stitches. So this is going to be 1. This is the 1, bind off 1, and then this is bind off 2. And then it says, knit to the last, for me, my size, knit to the last 3 stitches, wrap and turn. So I'm going to knit until there are 3 stitches left on my left needle, and then I'm going to wrap and turn. So I bring the yarn forward, I slip the first stitch off the left needle, take the yarn back, slip that stitch back, and then I am going to turn. Okay, so I turned, and notice how I have not finished this row. Still using that same yarn, I'm going to follow the next instruction that says wrong side, and it says purl to neck edge. So I'm going to be purling to here. And then I have my semicolon. I reach my gap. Okay. And then it says, after I bridge the gap and I pick up my new yarn, I'm now going to bind off 2 stitches. So 1, binding off 1, and then 2, and then it says to go to the last 3 stitches again for me, which would be right here. There's 3 stitches left on my left needle, and I'm going to wrap and turn, and this time I'm wrapping and turning from the purl side, so my yarn's in front. I slip, take the yarn in back, and slip back to the left needle, and then I turn. So I will continue working this way, paying attention to my semicolons, paying attention to which yarn I'm using, and get through the short row section of the shaping of these shoulders. The back will be worked pretty much the same as the front with some modifications, but still the same idea of working to the neck edges, binding off, and doing some wrap and turning for the back also. So that is this video for today, and please look for future videos from me soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.